大家好，欢迎收看今天的全球瞭望，我是郭崇文。今天我们专访的对象是马凯硕先生。马凯硕先生长期服务于新加坡外交部，曾经担任过驻联合国的代表，后来也曾转到学术界，担任新加坡大学李光耀公共政策学院的院长。他这一次来台湾是参加由台湾研究基金会跟长鹏文教基金会所举办的国际学术研讨会。Welcome, Professor Mabari, to be on our show.
Happy to be here.
I would like to begin the question with your new book, Has the West Lost It? You argue that the U.S. should start preparing to become the number 2 power in the world, and while China will be the number 1. What gave you the idea of this prediction, and how soon will we be able to see that the U.S. has become number 2 instead of number 1?
Well, the date doesn't matter. It may happen in 10 years, it may happen in 15 years. It doesn't matter. It's going to happen.
Right.
And I think it's a big strategic mistake on the part of the United States of America not to prepare for a world in which it is going to become number 2. And because of that, the United States of America is making some serious strategic mistakes in its behavior. So this book, Has the West Lost It, is actually in some ways a gift to America, a kind of a love letter to say, hey, you're my friend. I see you walking towards a cliff, right? And then the cliff is coming. Do I, as a friend, tell you, keep on walking? Or as a friend, tell you, please turn around?
Right.
It's a different world. And it is inevitable that America is going to become number 2. And therefore, America is going to make some painful strategic choices. It cannot do everything.
Right.
Now, right now, the United States think it can sort of take a strong stand against China, intervene in the Middle East, stand up to Russia, do everything. Excuse me. Those days are gone. You have to adjust to a different world that is coming. And at the same time, I quote President Bill Clinton in this book as saying that if America is going to be number 1 forever, then fine. Keep on doing whatever you want to do. But Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if you can conceive of a world in which America is number 2, then surely it is in America's national interest to strengthen multilateral rules, processes, institutions. And as you know, right now America is doing the exact opposite. Right. It's undermining multilateralism, where it is in its national interest to strengthen multilateralism. And that's why one of the key recommendations of this book is that the United States should make a U-turn and now support multilateralism instead of undermining it.
But let me ask you, with the trade war still going on, people are seeing there's still a big gap between China and the United States. See what's happening for ZTE and what happened, they didn't get the US-made chips. So that is exactly, people argue, the reason why China want to concede, and exactly the reason why China want to build up its core industry like Made in China 2025. So can China succeed in doing that? Or put it in other words, can the US prevent from China surpassing the United States?
Well, I think, number one, America cannot stop China. It's impossible. And it cannot stop for a very simple reason. No? It's because of history. From the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. Now, it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and America took off. But the last 200 years of world history, if you view it against the backdrop of the 2,000 years of world history, is an aberration. Now, all aberrations come to a natural end. So it is perfectly natural for China to return as number one, and America cannot stop it. Now, it can delay it by a little. It can try to trip up China a little bit, but it cannot change the fundamental direction. And on these trade wars, I think America is being very unwise for many reasons. One, it is easier for a non-democracy like China to accept pain than for a democracy to do so. And as you know, President Trump is going to face a very difficult time this November. If he loses the House and the Senate, he'll be in trouble. Now, all that China has to do is to target the vulnerable constituencies, right? Swing them to Republican to Democrat.
All those agricultural states.
Agricultural states. And then Trump is in trouble. So I think President Trump is not thinking strategically. And that, sadly, is one of his biggest limitations, because, you know, he works by the day. He goes from tweet to tweet and doesn't think of a long-term strategy. So a trade war like this is something that, of course, China will feel some pain. But China can absorb the pain and say, okay, now we've learned a lesson. Like you mentioned ZTE. What's the big lesson China is going to learn from ZTE? Never rely on America. So basically, America, which right now has a comfortable position of being able to, in a sense, dominate the supplies to China, will find 10 years from now it can no longer do so. So think strategically. Think whether it is in America's interest to do this. And I think, unfortunately, the Americans have lost the art of thinking strategically. And as a result of this, I fear, and I say this as a friend of America, I'm not an enemy of America. As a friend of America, I see America going to make strategic mistake after strategic mistake after strategic mistake in the next 10, 20 years.
But you do mention a point in one of your comments that it seems there's a general consensus now in the United States to against China. You warn that China may be underestimating how dramatically U.S. political and public opinion is swinging against Beijing. We are seeing this general shift across the party line, even in academia, even in business community. And why do you think that there's such a dramatic change? We used to see that there's a divided opinion, some pro-China, some against China. Why now all of a sudden the majority is against China?
Well, in some ways, this was inevitable. Because, you know, Americans had basically assumed that China could not succeed. In fact, you know, I'm writing my project this year. I'm on a sabbatical in 2018. My project this year is to write a book on the future of U.S.-China relations. And I have found quotation after quotation after quotation by senior American people like Hillary Clinton, who almost became president, saying, well, China is on the wrong side of history. China cannot succeed. Only democracies can succeed. Since China is run by a communist party, it cannot succeed. That was the theory. But then the practice proved to be the opposite of the theory. China is succeeding and continuing to succeed. And so the Americans, I think, are feeling very angry. They thought that they would always be number one. Now they realize they're going to become number two, and become number two to a non-democracy, to a non-Western power. And as this seeps in, the anger grows quite naturally. And frankly, China has made mistakes. I think China, for example, became assertive on the South China Sea too early, and this created a backlash. And as a result of that, the Americans exploited that backlash against China and tried to use it, as you know, to isolate China. So today, many Americans believe, even though the evidence is not there, that China has become an aggressive power. But you know, the Chinese military doesn't fight wars anywhere overseas. The United States military is fighting wars overseas. So, but that's the perception. And what's tragic is that China has lost the support of the American business establishment. And that's a tragedy because the American business establishment is very influential in America, and actually for a long time was pro-China, because American companies are making lots of profits from China. And they actually were the most pro-China constituency. So having lost them, in a sense, you had a kind of a dike, you know, the dike that was preventing the anti-China sentiment, and that was created by the American business community. But when the American business community stepped aside, the dike broke, and so the flood of anti-China sentiment has risen. So I would say, you know, I was in Beijing a few weeks ago at Tsinghua University, and I met some former Chinese leaders, and I told them, you know, be careful. There is a lot of anti-China sentiment in America today, and therefore all the policies that China used for the last 20 years in trying to manage America that work very well will not work in the next 20 years.
Okay, I'd like to switch to other topics. The coming summit between United States and North Korea in Singapore. They try to reach a denuclearization agreement. What kind of implication would that be for the whole Asia? And what if there's no agreement between them?
Well, number one, I hope that it happens. And if it happens, and if it succeeds, I will write an article saying President Donald Trump should get a Nobel Peace Prize. But I think he deserves it. I think if President Trump pulls off a successful summit with North Korea, it is actually in some ways a political miracle. I mean, people forget, this is June 2018. Remember what the world was like a year ago, June 2017. North Korea was carrying out nuclear tests. North Korea was shooting missiles. Everyone thought the situation was becoming more dangerous. So a year later, if President Trump can carry off a successful summit with President Kim, and I hope it happens, it's a big deal. And we should really praise Donald Trump for this and give him a Nobel Peace Prize. And I think what it does is that it will lower the temperature in the region significantly, because by far the hottest issue in East Asia is the Korean Peninsula. And I think if you can create a stable relationship, and if North Korea becomes like a normal country, focusing on economic development, which President Kim wants to do, by the way. You know, he's a very unusual. He's unlike his father and his grandfather. President Kim actually wants to develop North Korea economically, and we should support him if he wants to do that. So that's I think that would be a major breakthrough for the region, and I think we should celebrate if the summit is a success.
You just mentioned that. In Asia, sometimes China made some mistakes, especially in the South China Sea. From the ASEAN point of view, how do you see China as a bully in the South China Sea or as a constructive force in the OBOR big project?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I've written a book on ASEAN, which I'm happy to note has been translated and published here in Taiwan too. I actually don't think that the China-ASEAN relationship has been damaged beyond repair by the South China Sea issue.
Okay.
For a start, the dispute is not between China and ASEAN. The dispute is between China and 4 ASEAN countries: Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, not with ASEAN as a whole. And I think hopefully this year ASEAN will be able to negotiate a code of conduct with China on how to manage the disputes in the South China Sea. So I think my sense is that after having made mistakes in South China Sea, China has learned the lesson. And you notice that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there were headlines every few days on South China Sea. Today, you open the newspapers, no news on South China Sea, except for the U.S. Navy going there. So I think China has managed to calm the temperature. And I think fundamentally, to go to your question about the Belt and Road Initiative, ASEAN states can be among the biggest beneficiaries of the Belt and Road Initiative, because the Belt and Road Initiative is where the belt is across Central Asia, and the road is the Maritime Silk Road across Southeast Asia. So a lot of the BRI traffic is going through Southeast Asia. In fact, the Minister of Home Affairs of Singapore, Mr. Shanmugam, said that 85% of the incoming BRI investment goes through Singapore, and 33% of the outgoing BRI investment goes through Singapore. And that's in Southeast Asia. So Singapore and Southeast Asia are big beneficiaries of the Belt and Road Initiative, and will continue to be so.
Singapore have been rotating chair of ASEAN this year. So how can Singapore can further contribute to the ASEAN and China cooperation? We noticed that several years ago, there's some tension between Singapore and China. How is the relation right now?
I would say the relations between Singapore and China now are good. As you know, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong met President Xi Jinping, and it was good that they met before Singapore became the chairman of ASEAN in January this year. And I think Singapore is very much committed to seeing a strong ASEAN-China relationship. And you know, I'm going to give a big secret away to you. Some chairmen of ASEAN are more effective than other chairmen. And Singapore is traditionally one of the most effective chairmen of ASEAN. So a lot will get done under Singapore's chairmanship. So I think a lot will be done also in terms of ASEAN-China relations under the chairmanship of Singapore. So you will see a very positive trajectory. And at the same time, I think that China, this is what I also document in my ASEAN book, that China, I think, is aware that the pressure from the United States is going to go stronger, right? As the United States perceives as becoming number two, which we discussed. So United States will try to exploit divisions, let's say within ASEAN, against China. So it is in China's interest to keep ASEAN cohesive and economically tied to China. So ASEAN cannot be used as an instrument by America against China. And ASEAN, by the way, is good friends with America and with China, and wants to keep good relations with both, but doesn't want to be used either as an instrument by China against America or as an instrument of America against China.
We'll take a short break and we'll be right. 我们休息一下，等一下回来，我们继续跟马凯硕先生来做访谈。